All right. I believe that we are live right now and want to welcome you to our YouTube channel here at Landmark Christian Fellowship. And I want to encourage you that if you are watching this as a way to support us, click the little thumbs up button on the video. As well, you can subscribe to our channel. I want to also encourage you to click on the little bell icon. That will also make you aware when we publish new material to our channel. So thank you very much. This is a test as we're going live, but what I want to do today is do a recap of our Following the Way devotional, episode 7, that's published this morning on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify. And due to some technical difficulties, it didn't get uploaded to YouTube. And so we're going live with a bit of a reprise about it. The title of our devotional today was Grief and Loss, Humility, and St. Benedict. And you might wonder, what does that all have to do with anything? We have been talking in these days about how we can grow in Jesus and how we can be intentional during this season of this coronavirus to be growing in Jesus. And so 2 days ago on the podcast, we were talking about from 2 Corinthians 4, this light momentary affliction that we find ourselves in, and how it is all these troubles and these challenges that we find that we're facing, and some of them can feel very overwhelming. In the midst of it, it is a light momentary affliction when we consider it and compare it to the eternal weight of glory that awaits us for those who are in Christ. And that's what 2 Corinthians 4 promises. And so on the back of that, I want to talk a little bit here for a few minutes about grief and loss and how we journey through grief and loss and how we approach grief and loss in our lives and how we handle it, because there is grief and there is loss many times during life, certainly not just in this certain season that we find ourselves in, but it is being faced right now for many people. We feel that there is grief and we feel loss, and we can feel all sorts of emotions during this time, and all sorts of emotions that are bubbling to the surface: anger and frustration and weariness and all those things. And so how do we handle that? Because if we don't know how to walk through grief and loss, and if we don't know how to handle it and how to process it in our lives, we will end up stopping and being bogged down and completely left incapacitated by this grief and loss. And yet it is the Lord's intention, and it's Jesus's way to actually bring us through grief and loss so that we actually grow, and we grow in our dependence on Him. We grow in understanding our weakness, and we grow in understanding our frailty. And so that actually pushes us into Jesus, and it pushes us to rely on Him and to come to a much deeper understanding of how He's working deep inside of our souls, in our hearts, and in every area of our lives. And so that's where we want to connect humility to grief and loss, because actually growing in humility is a profound way of how we handle grief and loss in our lives. And we may not immediately make that connection, but it is a profound connection to see that growing in humility, and maybe not even in how we might think, how we think of humility, but actually that there are steps, and it leads to deep transformation inside of us. And so I want to talk about this in light of some steps of growing in humility that St. Benedict's in church history talked about. And in his book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, Pete Scazzero, he has a chapter on embracing grief and loss, which is a phenomenal chapter. And I would encourage you to read the book. It's phenomenal. But he talks there, he develops some of this growth in humility from St. Benedict's, and he puts it into a ladder, if you will, of 8 steps. And so I want to go through that here for the next few minutes as an encouragement so that we can assess where we're at. We can understand how growth in humility actually connects us to the deep transformative work of Jesus inside of us. And so I want to read from Emotionally Healthy Spirituality for us this morning. And so St. Benedict, he had he was the one who had developed this, calling it his ladder of humility. And Pete Scazzero revised it a little bit and put it into a bit of a shorter set of steps for the book. But he says that this ladder of humility begins step 1 with fear of God and mindfulness of him. And we often forget the presence of God in our lives. Even as Christians, we can actually many times act as functional atheists, where we actually don't have mindfulness of him. We don't have mindfulness of his presence. We're living our lives. We're making our own decisions day in and day out. And actually, if we're honest, or if we stop and take time to actually process, we're doing it with very little mindfulness of God. And so growing in humility begins with seeing that God is actually present, and we come into a understanding of that, a mindfulness and a fear of him, in a fear of meaning a recognition of his holiness and his goodness and his utter completeness and how much we need him. Step 2 is doing God's will, meaning not our own and not other people's will. We recognize that it's actually about surrendering our self-will to God's will for our lives. And this touches the very heart of spiritual transformation in us. And so, it's coming to see that it's not about me just surrendering to other people's wills and in order to make them feel better or to make myself feel better. And it's certainly not about my will. It's actually about surrendering myself to the will of God. It's coming into the fullness of Philippians 2, if you will, of seeking the goods of others and not my own, and surrendering myself to that. Step 3, and it also connects to this, is willing to subject ourselves to the direction of others. We're free to give up our arrogance and our all-powerfulness, and we're open to accepting God's will as it comes through others. And so this might be a manager at work or directions from a friend, but we do it without grumbling or with an attitude. We come to a place of being able to receive from people, being willing to receive from people. We might call this being teachable. It's growth. It's character growth in humility, of surrendering ourselves to others. Step 4 then is we are patient to accept the difficulties of others. And so life with others, especially when living in community, is full of aggravations and full of frustrations as characters are rubbing off on one another. And so this requires actually that we give others a chance to figure out their own weaknesses in their own way and in their own time. And this is difficult for many of us. And I find this difficult because we want to fix people and we want to help people and we want to give our own opinions, and we might have insight, we might have wisdom, and we might actually have walked through life experiences, and we may have actually journeyed through things with God. And yet, growing in humility, this step is patient to accept the difficulties of others. The 5th step in this ladder of humility is a radical honesty to others about our own weaknesses and our own faults. We quit pretending to be something that we're not. We admit our weaknesses and our limitations to friends, to a spouse, to parents, or someone else who cares deeply about our development. It's about being vulnerable. It's about being transparent with our weaknesses. And this is an absolute necessity for growing in humility. If we don't grow in this way, we will very much come to stunted growth in humility. And it'll actually be a masked sort of pride, because we won't actually be willing to operate to a depth of vulnerability that we need to grow in humility. Step 6 is being deeply aware that I am the chief of all sinners, as Paul wrote in the New Testament. We see ourselves actually as potentially weaker and more sinful than anyone else around us. And so the faults and the sins of others that we see around us actually begin to be minimized as we begin to see the depths of our own depravity, the depths of our own weakness, the depths of our own sin. And all of a sudden it leads to a much deeper level of humility. And so in saying this, in coming to recognize that we are the chief of all sinners, that doesn't mean that we are in sort of some self-hatred mode, or this is not an invitation to abuse at the hands of others, but it is meant to actually make us kind and gentle. Step 7 then on this ladder, getting near the top, is purposeful to speak less and with more restraint. And this is near the top of the ladder because it can be seen as an outcome of a life that seeks God and is actually filled with wisdom. And, a big part of wisdom is being slow to speak, quick to listen, growing in that over time. And some of us, and I find myself in this, where maybe we've, for a lot of our lives, been very quick to speak, or we have a propensity to speak and part of our personality, and that's maybe our inclination. And growth, and we're all at different levels of this, but growth is learning to speak less with more restraint. And it can be very practical. It can be the guy in the grocery store that is every aisle right now where you're supposed to go one way and he's purposely going the other way, and you just want to say something to him because he should know better, and why is he having to do this? And wisdom and growing in humility is actually learning to say, maybe I'm not going to say anything and I'm going to restrain myself, because I'm actually in that I'm growing in humility. And I don't have to be right, and I don't have to tell everyone that they're wrong, even if they are very obviously wrong about something. As the rule of St. Benedict, he states, the wise are known for their few words. And Proverbs is full of that a gentle word turns away wrath, and harsh word brings wrath. Step 8, so the top rung on this ladder of humility, is being transformed into the love of God. And so this is a place where, and I think that in some respects, we never reach this fully, not on this side of eternity. This is the goal of becoming more like Jesus. This is the journey. This is the trajectory, if you will. This is the growth, seeking growth in Christ. And so in certain areas, we may reach a real level of maturity in this. And then there's going to be other areas where we struggle. But it is about growth. It is about this constant state of, am I growing, assessing that. And I actually, at the end of our message this past Sunday, I talked a little bit about that, giving ourselves some questions to assess growth, about where am I at with fellowship, with my fellowship with Jesus? Where am I at with my generosity? Am I generous as a person? And those sorts of things. And so this transformed into the love of God, it means that in that place, there's no haughtiness, there's no pride, there's no air of superiority at all. There's no sarcasm, there's no put downs, there's no airs of importance, there's no seeking to make yourself look better at the expense of others. There's none of that. We are in this place, we're able to embrace our limits and those of others. We're fully aware of how fragile we are, and we are under no illusions. We are not walking in deception. We're not walking in seeing ourselves as something that we're not. We're at home with ourselves and content actually to rely on the mercy of God. And we look at everything in life in this sphere. Everything is a gift. Everything. There's reasons to be thankful and to be full of gratitude everywhere around us. At every turn, there's opportunities for gratitude, more and more and more. And so when I look at this ladder of humility, I think there is something to be said that we probably at times in our lives, we move up and down this ladder, and in different areas we move up and down. But overall, I think the goal would be, as a follower of Jesus, and the heart and the desire would be that as we look at this growth in humility, that as we pull back and we look at the graph of our life, if you will, and maybe the different areas that we're working on, but there's an upward trajectory, there's growth. And so there might be little, when you pan in closer, there might be little dips where we've gone down and we've actually had to work through things. But then overall, when you pull back, you see that there's this trajectory of growth that is marked and defining our lives because we're becoming more like Jesus. And so this has been a real gift to me, thinking about this in this time of this pandemic, and thinking through the restrictions on us, thinking about grief and loss and change and things lost and things that have been taken away and the uncertainty of the time and all these things that we're feeling and the emotions that we're feeling. Talked about that in the podcast a couple of days ago, about the depth and the range of emotions that people are feeling, and very different. And so that's all about journeying through grief and loss. But learning to grow in humility is a great gift to become more like Jesus, and as we walk through those steps. And so I hope that was as much an encouragement to you and a blessing as it was to me. And I want to just bless you and encourage you in these days to spend time in the Word with the Lord, putting those things before Him, assessing where you're at, spending time, getting quiet, and listening to your heart. Where am I at? What are the things I'm struggling with? And where does Jesus want to grow and do His healing work inside of me? So bless you, friends. This was a little bit of a test, a special edition of Following the Way. Trust that it was a blessing. And I'm trusting right now that this is working. So we will see you again. And once again, I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel. And you can also, of course, listen to this podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify as well. So have a wonderful afternoon. Blessings.